Join the movement as we sit down for another awesome interview with another powerful thought provoker, Dr. Zach Walsh.
Okay, I'm a clinical psychologist. What's the angle that is going to be where I can use my expertise in addictions and in clinical psychology to address this cannabis issue, which I still saw largely as a policy issue?
Dr. Walsh was the principal investigator for a clinical trial evaluating the efficacy of cannabis for post-traumatic stress disorder. As an undergrad student, Zach spent time working within the prisons and came to realize how destructive prohibition was for society.
Going into grad school, I worked in jails in the US as part of my training because I was so offended by the war on drugs. It's just such a horrible and seemed fixable social problem.
He emphasizes the importance of breaking stigma and ending prohibition once and for all. So we're sitting here with Zach Walsh, Associate Professor at UBC, and you're a clinical psychologist. Yep. And I know that you are in charge of a therapeutic, what's the rest of that?
We're doing a clinical trial of cannabis for PTSD, for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
Oh, are you asking about my lab? Is that it?
That was the lab.
Oh yeah, that one's a tongue twister. The acronym's TRIPS. But we had to go a long way to get there.
Yeah, that TRIPS is good.
If there's one thing I've learned, it's don't start with the acronym. The Therapeutic, Recreational, and Problematic Substance Use Lab at UBC.
Okay. I want to ask you, for one, you're a consumer of cannabis yourself?
Yes.
Right. How long have you been using for?
I've been medical. I've had my medical license for I think about 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah.
Felt good when you got the license.
It did, because it allowed me to reduce the stigma and think about how I use cannabis and how I use other medicines as well.
So, what was the driving force that pushed you into getting behind this plant and bringing it into your work?
Well, I've always been interested in social change and social justice. Even before I went to grad school, I worked with Greenpeace for 10 years, from high school all through undergrad, and other social justice movements. So that's always where I felt comfortable and where I felt that where I feel most alive and most active. So that piece of it was very interesting for me. And going into grad school, I worked in jails in the US as part of my training because I was so offended by the war on drugs. It's just such a horrible and seemed fixable social problem, right? That we could change the laws and that would impact the lives of so many people. So I came at it almost politically, which is ironic as a scientist, but I thought, yeah, we've got to find a way to decriminalize cannabis or legalize cannabis, because right now it's increasing the harms as much as they are, but the harms are mostly due to the criminal nature of it. So when I returned to Canada from my training in the States, I'm born in Winnipeg and raised in Winnipeg. The dispensaries were getting going. When I was in Kelowna, there was one dispensary at that time. I thought, this is such a cool social movement, and it's an opportunity to work towards legalizing it, but I wasn't as aware of the actual medical potential, the actual therapeutic potential, and I was kind of curious. Okay, I'm a clinical psychologist. What's the angle that is going to be where I can use my expertise in addictions and in clinical psychology to address this cannabis issue, which I still saw largely as a policy issue, that it was wrong that it's illegal, but I didn't understand the potential as a medicine. And so I started working with dispensaries and seeing how can we at least document what's going on here to show the benefits and show the harm reduction. And I started to see how many people were using cannabis for things like depression and anxiety, mainstream mental health concerns. And knowing how so many people were left out of the effects of mainstream approaches to that, antidepressants, benzodiazepines, work for some people, but for a lot of people they don't. And for a lot of people, the side effects are worse than the situation they started with, or at least worse than they have to be. So I wanted to put in alternatives, and that's when I started to see the potential of cannabis as a medicine for mental health.
And what was it that, where did you see it? Was it the work that you were doing at the time, or was this what led into you starting your own work? Like, was this just things that you saw from people that you were interacting with?
Yes, starting to see the patient stories, and then starting to dig into the research, and then seeing the research, seeing where there was holes, where there's just hasn't, at that time there was very little on cannabis and mental health. We'd go back to the 1850s and there was stuff on cannabis and depression, and mostly talking to patients. I mean, it's been patients that have really led the way through medical cannabis, and it's certainly patient stories that led me to to believe in the potential as a medicine, not just as something that shouldn't be illegal, but as something that could be promoted to enhance health and well-being beyond a recreation or a way to relax and just enjoy, but actually something that could help people who are really suffering, coincidentally in the very areas that I was working with.
What are your thoughts on CBD cannabis working as substitution programs for the opioid crisis?
Well, that was, I have to give credit to Philippe Lucas, because I started working with him when I was working with dispensaries, and he was still working with dispensaries at that time. And he talked to me about substitution. I thought, well, yeah, that's interesting, sure. We'll put that in the survey when we were doing that first survey of medical cannabis users. And that eventually was in a LARD and has resulted in a number of publications. But he's the one, and we've published the substitution data from that, but he was the first one who said, ask them if they're using it instead of alcohol, instead of opioids. And I thought, well, that's interesting, let's see where that goes. Since then, I think that's really key to understanding from a public health perspective the potential of cannabis and of cannabis deregulation or legalization to enhance public health. If it's being used on top of other medicines, then there's potential there as well. But the real, I think some of the real benefits are reductions in use of other medicines or drugs and the side effects that those have. So we've seen, in the reductions in opioid overdose deaths. We've seen reductions in traffic accidents due to reduced alcohol use. And those things can be huge. So I think adding cannabis to those options of sanctioned drugs is great.
James, your question that you had, or what were you asking specifically? Because I thought I missed something.
The reduction in violent crimes, domestic and otherwise, related in alcohol consumption going down with cannabis being legal in these areas, in these populations.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the reduction in alcohol is almost, it's almost a theory of violence in itself. I mean, so much violence in our society is related to alcohol. So much violence is in the home, and so much of it is domestic violence. It's the largest proportion of violent crimes are committed from people who know each other well. We tend to be scared if you're walking alone in a dark alley, but really the place where most violent crimes take place is in the home, and of those crimes, overwhelmingly alcohol is involved. So to the extent that people can use cannabis instead of alcohol, it doesn't have the same disinhibiting, violent-inducing characteristics that alcohol does. So I think we really have a potential to reduce domestic violence. And there's a study from a few years ago that followed a bunch of married couples through the first 7 years of marriage. And it found the lowest rates of violence in couples where both used cannabis. And it also found a reduction in aggression of wives towards husbands if the husbands used cannabis. So it was not just as straightforward as stopping violence, it actually helped the couples get along better. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential there.
Cannabis, this is more of a question for me. I'm quite certain that I suffered from PTSD, probably from issues going all the way back to childhood, getting arrested in 2010, being pulled away from my family, having to serve 8 months in a U.S. prison. I never thought about it at the time that I was probably going to come out of that with PTSD, but I definitely did. And I've always been a user, and there's been definitely of cannabis, and there's obviously been times like after these periods of having a lot of turmoil where I've relied on it a little bit more. But my concern is, or was at the time, and I'm still trying to figure it out, was there ever a point of where I was doing too much, of where I was suppressing feelings that I needed to be dealing with? What are your thoughts on that?
When I think about cannabis and PTSD, I think a lot of it has to do with symptom relief, as opposed to some of those other emerging treatments, plant medicines for trauma, like psilocybin or MDMA, where it helps you to encounter, and particularly MDMA, where it helps you to encounter the traumatic experience in a way that is less threatening, and you really work through it. Instead of dampening it down, you work through the trauma, but you're under the effects of the medicine that makes it more palatable or more possible to stick with it. I don't think cannabis works that way. That's more like almost like a surgical intervention where you have a limited time period and you get the drug, and then hopefully you're better on the other side of it. The way I see cannabis working is relieving the symptoms, particularly with PTSD, nightmares, sleep disturbance, feeling really keyed up all the time, irritability. And those things drive people away, and they cause other parts of your life to start to fall apart. And then you get into a vicious cycle, and the PTSD gets worse as the relationships and the general functioning get worse. Cannabis, I hope, and I've seen it happen, where people get their sleep back, the dreams are not so bad, they're easier to be around, so they're able to have those social support relationships. At that point, you have the strength to start to do the really agonizing work of dealing with the trauma, because you're not ready to do that, perhaps, if you're still not sleeping, and if you're having the nightmares, and if there's no one around you, and you're irritable all the time. It makes it hard to do the deeper healing. So I think cannabis can support people to take that next step, to heal more deeply, and hopefully get to a point where cannabis use becomes a choice that they can take or leave, rather than a necessary medicine.
In a way, cannabis twofold. It can help you relieve the symptoms of your trauma at the same time as if it's introduced to the person creating the trauma, there's a reduction in those people, like at the same time.
It can sort of break the cycle, and I think it also puts you in a better place to do that really challenging work of healing more deeply from the trauma.
It allows you to chill.
It allows you to chill so that you can maybe get into therapy and start
Yes.
to do some of that re-experiencing desensitization work that's so difficult, and that for a lot of people who suffer with PTSD, they're just not ready for it. It's too agonizing if they're already in so much pain. So I think you have to get people to a place where they're strong and more comfortable, and I think cannabis is a great way of doing that.
Do you see a preferred way in taking it, whether it's through inhalation or ingesting?
I think it probably varies from person to person. It depends on what you're using it for. If it's something where you're going to want a longer duration of effects for sleep to inhibit nightmares, then probably an edible. If it's something where you need something that's going to be more quick onset to help you calm down in times of emergency or acute stress, then inhalation is more effective right away.
Right. So we're doing a lot of clinical trials. They're coming in now, and there's government's funding a lot more now. And how many more years do you think we're going to have to wait until we've got a full array of information there where people can be able to come to the source and go, wow, okay, this is me, this is what I can use, boom, this is what I'm going to go to?
I think we're going to know a whole lot more in a decade. This stuff takes a lot of time, and one study will show one thing, and another study will be slightly different, and we'll find something else. And so it's not that one study is going to solve it. We need to get that sort of critical mass of research, and on so many different indications. So I think we'll know a lot more in 10 years. I think one thing that's interesting and maybe distinct about cannabis compared to some single molecule medicines, pharmaceutical medicines that are one single active ingredient, and then you can dose it and get some pretty consistent findings. I think we'll get some of that with cannabis, and we've seen that with Sativex already, but when it comes to whole plant cannabis, I still think there's going to be some trial and errors in people's individual endocannabinoid system and the different properties and entourage effects and the interactions of different cannabinoids and terpenes. It would take many lifetimes to test all those different interactions. So I think we'll get some big picture stuff that's going to be really helpful over the next decade, but I still think we'll probably get as many questions as we do answers, but we'll know a lot more. So
that was a setup question for my next question, or talking about Move the Movement and what we're doing. So as you know, Move the Movement is, we're building a living database. You can go online. We're trying to empower people to come on, share their stories, break the stigma of the plant, leading into legalization. And we believe that if we can get hundreds of thousands, millions of people coming forward and telling their story, breaking it down to everything that works for them, that doesn't work for them, the types of plants they use, the issues that they've got, we believe there's going to be a lot of power in that. Do you see anything where that would not work? I'm trying to find the right words. Or is there
anecdotal evidence?
It is.
We think like all these anecdotal stories hold like that knowledge of the plant that like.
Well, Salome said on stage today, she goes, we know that this has been used probably for 10,000 years, but there's so much information that has been lost, and it was anecdotal evidence that was told from generation to generation through stories to stories, and that's what we're trying to build back, right? So the clinical trials they're important. We need factual information where we can actually set this up. The movement, patient telling the story, going in, for one, we know it empowers them. One person's truth can then lead to empowering another person. The question that I have for you, what can we do to help make that a better system, or possibly drive people to our site to encourage them to share their story?
Well, I think we need all the stories. I mean, they're all stories, right? A clinical trial is a type of story. It's a story about we took 100 people and gave them something where they didn't know what it was, and 50 of them got the cannabis and 50 didn't, and those 50 did better on these questionnaires, which are stories of their own. And those are the kind of stories that regulators want to hear. But they may not be the kind of stories that really speak to individuals. So I think we need all those kind of stories, and remembering that they're all stories, that one doesn't have to be privileged so highly over another type. There's a real genius to a clinical trial. I mean, it makes sense, right? Logically, people don't know what they're getting, and if they think that if you know what they got, and so if the one that is cannabis, if those people did better, then, I mean, that's an appealing story. But there's also a piece of that story where it's so expensive to be able to tell that story that it limits who gets to speak. So I think what's so great about something like Move the Movement is it's inviting other people who have wisdom and who have important information and important stories to share those stories as well. So it's not just this one story where the entrance into the storytelling club is incredibly high.
That was awesome. Do you have anything that you'd like to add, anything that you would like to say to the viewers who are watching what we're putting into production? Is there anything that you would like to see both Canada and the world at large, what we need to do to move ahead? What do you see as your ultimate vision?
I think what's going to be important moving forward is just cutting out the stigma. I mean, we've seen what 100 years, give or take, of stigma have done to just change everyone's perceptions of this plant to the point where they bear so little resemblance to the actual properties of the plant. And it's terrifying to see how misinformation can lead to so much suffering. But I mean, I think if we can flip that, if we have 50 years or 20 years of actual information and stories like what you guys are saying, and also what the clinical trials can tell us, I think we can use that same power to flip the story, and I just look forward to seeing what comes from that.
Awesome. Nice work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Seriously, thank you for what you're doing in your role in moving us ahead. It's awesome. I'm just going to put my hand out and say thank you again so much.
Thanks.
That was fantastic.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Lots of fun.
When you know, as a clinical psychologist, associate professor at UBC, you'd see the issues of disconnection, the plague that is on society.
And you know, in our surveys where we've talked to, we did a study of students who use cannabis and alcohol, that they respond to using both, and it's like when and why do you use which? And they said or why would they choose to use cannabis instead of alcohol? Why choose alcohol instead of cannabis on a given night? And they would choose cannabis because less hangover, less likely that they were going to get in some kind of accident or have some kind of a problem, embarrass themselves one way or the other. And they were using alcohol because they could use it socially and they could go out in public. So it was all about the stigma. So when that's relieved, what's going to be the choice? And I think a worry is that some institutions, universities and other institutions, might take on the role of prohibitionists and say, okay, yeah, it's legal, but not here. There's no cannabis on campus. And if they do that, they're just going to be incentivizing alcohol use and all the problems that come with that. So to unleash the social power, like you're talking about, of connecting people and providing them a way to relax and have a good time without poisoning themselves using alcohol, we have to make sure the regulations allow that. And yeah, I think that's a problem right now is what do we have in terms of being able to consume in public? We still don't know, do we?
No, we don't. Not yet.
Well, we still got 2 weeks.